Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on critical thinking. I'm going to give people a minute or so to join, but in the meantime, we're just going to go through a few housekeeping bits of information. So first, please feel free to ask your questions using the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. We'll go to the Q&A at the end of the session after Tom's presentation. Also, today's session is being recorded, and we will send you the recording along a few additional resources that you might want to check out. And I think we're ready to start. So we're going to start with some introductions first. Oh, there we go. So Diana and I are senior marketing managers for Sage Skills and Sage Campus, respectively. And joining us today is our very special guest, Dr. Tom Chatfield. Tom is an author, tech philosopher, and educator. His books exploring contemporary culture, most recently Live This Book, and the best-selling textbook, Critical Thinking, which I just happen to have in my hands right now, have been published in over 30 languages. Tom is also the instructor of the Sage Campus course on critical thinking and the editor-in-chief of the Sage Skills Student Success module on the same topic. Tom is interested in improving our understanding of digital technology and its uses in policy, education, and engagement. He's particularly interested in AI ethics, critical thinking, and future skills, and works with business schools, universities, and companies around their development, as well as creating award-winning online courses for both academic institutions and businesses.
So in addition to the great work that Tom has already done with his critical thinking book, and as mentioned by Maria on our student success resource, Tom has also contributed to Sage Campus. He is an editor and an instructor for student success and campus. He focuses his expertise on helping learners strengthen and master their critical thinking skills and evaluating sources, evidence, arguments, reasoning, and more through these two library resources, all addressing skills that can really help students succeed in their early and advanced studies, and as well in the everyday world. On the next slide is a little bit more of a high-level scope of what those resources that Tom has contributed to really cover. Building skills that traverse the undergraduate journey from day one and beyond are the areas of specialty for Sage Skills and Campus. They offer a cohesive, really progressive and scaffolded approach to learning critical skills that are useful from, again, the student's first year at college to later years in graduate school and even in the workplace. So thank you, Tom, for your contributions to Sage Skills and Campus, and especially for your time with us today. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to talk for about half an hour, going through a few very practical thoughts around what critical thinking is and the kind of exercises and techniques that I use to try and bring it to life for learners, for businesses, to try and lay the foundations of critical thinking, not just as an academic practice, but also as a habit, a way of working, a way of thinking about thinking that's incredibly important in our algorithmic age, in this age when increasingly we have instantaneous, miraculous answers at our fingertips. But that only means it's all the more important that we ask the right questions and know why and how we want to pursue any particular line of inquiry. Throughout this little talk, I'm going to get you to do some thinking as well, which I hope you enjoy. I'm not going to make you speak, don't worry, but I am going to, at 3 different points, invite you to type thoughts into the chat if you want to. You don't have to, it's completely up to you. But I find one of the most important things about critical thinking is precisely that trying to do it is very different on an emotional and intellectual level than talking about doing it. That getting people doing exercises and reflecting upon their own emotions and assumptions, as well as abstract claims, is very powerful and very important for embedding it as a habit in pedagogy, in study, in an institution, rather than just saying it's a good thing and then not doing it. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and go into presenter mode. Can I get a thumbs up from one of the facilitators just to let me know that we can actually see my slides? Is that okay?
Yeah,
Thank
we
you
can
so
see
much.
it.
Hooray, great. And I'm assuming you can hear me as well, and that I'll get a panicked message if you can't. So where I usually start with critical thinking is by drawing a distinction between critical and uncritical modes of thought. Because while critical thinking is good, is great, is marvelous, it can also be rather abstract. It can feel like an ideal. Whereas uncritical thinking is very familiar and also very vivid when it comes to some of the traps that all of us fall into. And this is, I think, is the most important point. Uncritical thinking is not just something that silly people do sometimes. It's not something that other people do. Uncritical thinking is something that all of us do sometimes in certain circumstances. And in particular, we tend to do it in circumstances where we are under various kinds of pressure or expectation. This is a delightful spam email which I received some while ago informing me about a secret Nigerian space program, which I didn't know existed, but it's very exciting because they want to give me lots of money. Now, we are all of us, I think, very hardened critics of spam email. This is a very old school piece of spam. It's playing off naivety. It makes the very simple point that critical thinking is partly about experience. If you've seen lots of spam messages, if you've had lots of people claiming they want to give you money online, very quickly you become a hardened critic because you have meaningful experience and expertise. A really interesting thing about spam emails like this, about spam and scams designed to fool vulnerable people, is precisely that they're very obvious and very easy to see through, because this acts as a form of selection. So a trick like this is so obvious to most people that only the most naive people, the people with the least critical experience or capacity, will fall for it. And that's very important for the scammers because they want people to self-select to be very vulnerable and very inexperienced. There are other ways of fooling people, of course. On the one hand, we play off people's greed and excitement and inexperience. On the other hand, we play off familiarity and authority. So phishing messages classically involve trying to get someone to click on a link or download a file by pretending to be just a colleague, by pretending to come from a familiar place, by being kind of boring and routine, by trying to slip beneath the surface of our notice. So emotionally speaking, it's exactly the opposite. Instead of trying to excite or frighten people into an uncritical action, this tries to simply slip past people's cognitive capacities unnoticed as something utterly routine. And again, a lot of phishing exercises involve the copying of familiar brands. This is trying to mix familiarity with discomfort. And if we look at up the top, we see that it's not actually from Netflix at all, it's being spoofed. But you might worry about your Netflix subscription and also trust Netflix. And just in one uncritical moment, click on it. And again, more and more, we see text messages coming to us which claim to be from banks, which claim to be from familiar and respected sources, and say, you've got to take this action. It's that combination, that very cognitively toxic combination of trust and urgency, of pressure applied selectively to our minds. Now, this is, of course, playing off cognitive shortcuts, rapid responses that tend to either be about familiarity, trust, and ease, or fear, anxiety, and anger, or some combination of these. The important point is that to be human is to have not enough time. We need to rely upon familiarity. It's appropriate to have strong reactions to urgent circumstances. So first and foremost, when we're trying to be critically reflective and self-reflective thinkers, we are required to be thinking about our own state of knowledge, our own state of trust, our own state of informity, our own state of emotion. And this often, I think, gets overlooked in an academic context because we tend to treat students and learners as though they have lots of time and are perfectly rational and in an ideal world will sit down and work through sources. We We perhaps gloss over the fact that a lot of people are rushed, bamboozled, overwhelmed, a little bit scared, looking for ways out, not fully in control, at least not all of the time. And so I think it's enormously important to talk about the foundational habits of, if you like, being your best self. And particularly in the context of AI tools, of incredibly powerful engines of work and pattern recognition and identification. We need to make really sure that people are kind of confident, critically discerning users of these systems, that they're able to pause and reflect upon what they want and why, and what's actually going on and what they truly need to know. So if critical thinking means assessing information and ideas from a reasoned and skeptical and evidence-based perspective, which is great, which is all about this cognitively slow, reasoned triangulation of your views, the kind of double checking of your own take against reality, we need to recognize that underlying this, there's a very practical toolkit for intellectual engagement and the time and the desire to use it. And I think in modern teaching environments, one of the great challenges is helping people to understand what it means for them to take control of their learning. And you'll notice, by the way, that all of the problems I've identified previously are associated with a lack of time, with pressure that's put on you by other people or by yourself. This is an incredibly fundamental point, and the first one I want to make, that in terms of tools to put critical thinking into practice, to build it into study and so on, if you don't pause, then critical reflection cannot take place. If you're rushed and harassed and cognitively depleted, if you're just going with your gut, well, sometimes your gut will be right, sometimes you'll be a hardened critic, but you cannot, by definition, reflect critically, think twice, and build a check, a balance. You cannot, as I sometimes say, go looking for cognitive reinforcements. And when we're reflecting critically, that's what we're doing. We're recognizing that in the moment we're in danger of making a misguided assessment, of arriving at an unevidenced judgment, at leaping to a conclusion without really considering alternatives, all of these things. So we need to recognize, therefore, that we are in need of help, that we're in need of reflection and reinforcement. And interestingly, in terms of pauses, it doesn't have to be, of course, about us wandering around being philosophical and thoughtful and taking ages to do anything. We have to be timely. It's partly about paying attention to the habits and the context that constitute our everyday working patterns. A pause can be very powerful, even if it's incredibly brief. Now, here's one silly example of one of my kind of personal favorite, I suppose, hacks, if you like, a tiny little bit of habit, a context that I find promotes me towards critical thinking more often than I might want to admit. And that is a time delay on my email. And what I mean by that is that when I press send on my email, I then have 30 seconds to take it back, and I see the message I've sent, and I can then retract it. It hasn't actually gone. And it is shocking how often I look back on a message I sent quickly, reread it, and if it's about anything more trivial than thanks very much, I realize that I haven't said what I meant to say. Instead of being clear, I've been slightly passive-aggressive, or I've missed the point, or I haven't made the attachment, or I've leapt to an unsupported conclusion. I've been ambiguous. I've been a little bit useless, a little bit too hasty. And ironically enough, that kind of haste makes more work for everyone. Seeking a clarification, creating an ambiguity, slows us down immensely. There's a tremendous power, I think, with the careful and selective application of small pauses. And indeed, among many others, I've spent some time with Jesuit colleges in the US and found myself greatly admiring a very formal reflective pause that just happened at the start of each study day there. Just a moment of silence and self-reflection when people just weighed up priorities were, what they knew, what they didn't. Small things can make all the difference. So here's an exercise for you to reflect upon, which I would invite you to think about, share in the chat if you want, don't share if you don't want, whatever you're comfortable with. And I simply want to ask you, what's one of your best personal individual habits that helps you find focus, that helps you be your best cognitive self, that helps you draw breath and think a little bit more critically and not just go with the flow. I talked about my little habit, my little hack of having a time delay in my email. Another thing I like to do when I can is simply, if I have something important, I'll take it off my computer, I'll print it out, and I'll go maybe with a cup of coffee and scribble on it longhand, because cognitively, in a kind of tactile, sensorial way, it just helps me slow down and engage in a kind of dialogue with myself. I'm looking at the chat right now. I love looking at the chat doing things like this. I always learn something. I'm afraid I'm going to shamelessly steal your ideas and put them into place in my life. A lot of people mentioning sleep, refreshment, exercise, meditation. Absolutely. Mindfulness. Oh, play the piano. I like that one. I'm a mad keen pianist. I'm going to bashing out the Goldberg variations very badly is a supreme way of just taking a moment. Your mileage may vary. Try not to respond fast. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Please go on sharing. Please go on thinking. And while you're thinking about this, I'd also just invite you to notice a really basic point, that thinking and sharing and reflecting and pausing, as we're doing now for about 3 minutes, is very, very different to just reading about this in a book or saying it's a good thing to do. There's something I think very powerful about just sharing, about doing the reflective exercise, about noticing your own emotional state. And of course, I'd also like you to notice that I've asked you a question that no AI in the world, no matter how powerful, will ever answer. What's one of your best habits? How do you find focus? Now, an AI or a search engine can brilliantly answer the question, what are some great ideas that might help you find focus? But by definition, it cannot introspect for you. It cannot tell you how you find focus. It cannot tell you what you're worried about. It cannot tell you what matters to you. It cannot tell you where your particular strengths and weaknesses and concerns are. It can't tell you what matters most to you and why. And that's fine. But if you don't spend time reflecting upon these things, of course, if your students, if those you work with have no time to reflect upon them, then these aren't just unanswered questions, they're unasked questions. And you may cut yourself off from some of the most important forms of learning. With all the power I have at the fingertips, I think I've got 3 LLMs open in the background on my desktop right now. But before I set them scurrying off in a whole bunch of different directions, I really need to know what and why and how my own priorities are. Otherwise, I just end up with no understanding in here whatsoever and a very convincing impression of someone who kind of understands out there. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's brilliant. I really appreciate it. And here's another question, just to throw in there for 2 minutes. What's one of the best institutional habits you've come across? And what I mean by this is very simple. I mean a norm, however formal or informal, that an institution, a group, a faculty, a society has. So for example, some organizations I've worked with, and I think this is becoming law in the EU, have email cutoffs. So, you do not send or receive email outside after 5 p.m., for example. Some people will have offline mornings. It's not all about being offline, of course, but there will sometimes be batching, i.e. there will be, a batching of an hour's time for this, an hour's time for that. Or protocols for communication. So you don't just send an email, you use Slack for certain things, you use a wiki for certain things, you use emails for certain things, you have certain formats, just to make sure that you're not wasting people's time. Can't send more than 3 emails to a colleague a day. I love that, an email budget. Do you get to save them up? Can you kind of store them up? Maybe not, that would be bad. Go away on holiday and then send 15 emails. I talk about email a lot here when I'm working with organizations as well as students, because it embodies a very interesting phenomenon that sociologists and others have written about. That you get, as it were, more time, more capability, more power. Do you bank it and become more relaxed? No, you tend to spend it on upgrading the quality or intensity of your experience. Your information experience, you just double down on sharing. From a certain angle, a lot of email inboxes are to-do lists written by other people. My email inbox is a to-do list written for me by other people. It's them filling my day with stuff. And ironically enough, I empty it by sending them emails, by replying and auto-responding. So we all make endless busy work for one another, rather than just sticking some stuff on a wiki or using a shared platform or getting on the phone or just waiting. The best email filter I have ever come across is time. Because if I wait a few days, suddenly those messages that were so urgent reveal themselves to be, in some cases, non-urgent, and in some cases, really important. Great stuff here in the chat. Really interesting on this. And really diverse. No right answer, right? Again, there's not some LLM that has got the perfect thing that everybody does and they're maximized. Instead, there is the habit of personal and collective reflection upon habits and norms and practices. And this iterative reflection is a foundational critical thinking skill. This iterative recognition that there's not some right, perfect answer that you get to and never debate it again, unless perhaps it's an empirical question like how tall is this mountain. When it comes to habits and cognition and working, it's more about reflecting upon the tools, the toolkit that you bring individually and collectively to the circumstances, and how you can elevate your cognition. This is the thing. Critical thinking, what is it in concrete? It's shying away from uncritical, default state, harassed, rushed, gut reactions to stuff that will sooner or later lead you into error and unhappiness. It's imperfect, of course, but it's about the elevation of cognition. And cognition is embodied in the body, in an institution, in a place and a time. And so you have to get specific. And actually, there's some really wonderful stuff here. I love varying spaces. I do think, my environment is partly how I think. I love a library. And I love the fact that when I travel around the place, giving talks and so on, students seem to love libraries too. Right? It seems to be top of the list of what people think people want out of an institution. And you might think that's strange in an era of remote work, but for me at least, and I'm sure some of you are more familiar than me with the data on this, among other things, a good library is a kind of anti-distraction device, a space that gives you permission to reflect, to think, to be your best self, to ask for help and to give help, to not be a kind of harassed, multitasking, unprofessional version of you. And learning to use a library is, among other things, about learning to use a space as well as the affordances of that space, to be part of a community of knowledge and practice. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. That's wonderful. So number two kind of builds on this, really. And it's about a very old philosophical idea. Yes, anti-distraction. So many books in the library. That's true. Good distraction, right? Serendipity. Practice the principle of charity. In philosophy, the principle of charity is not about giving money, although it's what my image suggests. It's about the very basic idea that perhaps most famously John Stuart Mill outlined in On Liberty, that if we know nothing about others' positions, the positions of those different from us or who disagree with us, then we don't really understand our own positions either. We could rephrase this in terms of kind of a Popperian account of science, the idea that if we just seek confirmation of a favored view, we will always be able to find it. If all we do is go out looking for support of the idea that all politicians are liars, or nothing can be done to help this, or these people are wrong, or those people are right, or I am unlucky, or nobody likes me, or the converse, we can endlessly find ideas to support any theory. So it is only when we engage richly and openly and thoughtfully with views that are not our own, with things that lie outside our knowledge and experience, that we get to do that precious thing of putting our ideas to a meaningful test. Another way of putting this, which the American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey outlined very beautifully in his book from the early 20th century, How We Think, is that there's a condition of constructive doubt, where we very seriously entertain the prospect that we are wrong, that our knowledge is incomplete, that there is a grand puzzle out there and that we only have a part of it. And that unless we actively seek to test our own ideas and look for gaps in our knowledge and understandings, we don't truly learn. We simply confirm a favored view of things. And of course, if we go back to the Pyrrhonian skeptics and others, we see this idea of fruitful delay, of the productive, the constructive tension. But how can we do this in practice? Well, there's exercises I love doing with students, and indeed businessmen, and indeed cabinet ministers, anybody really. And school children, although they are terrifying. Building steel rather than straw men. I'm sure you've heard of these ideas. A straw man is a ridiculous caricature of someone else's views that only exists so that you can burn it. It basically describes what happens in most of politics. My opponent, you stand up and say this, my opponent believes we should be rewarding criminals. My opponent is soft on crime. My opponent says that we should be paying criminals to commit crime. This is absurd. Vote for me. Now, this may get you a round of applause in Parliament, but it doesn't promote understanding. It doesn't promote learning. It doesn't build any kind of a common ground between different factions. It doesn't seek truth. It doesn't seek improvement. It doesn't seek knowledge. It turns debate into a battle. This is perhaps much of politics, but it is not the business of learning. And the comfort with discomfort that comes from very seriously trying to come up with the strongest possible view of others' arguments, I think is an incredibly important emotional as well as cognitive and learning skill. Again and again on social media and elsewhere, we see people who caricature their opponents as idiots who are misinformed and acting in bad faith. Now, this may be true, but that is a very harsh and important judgment to arrive at. Unless you have very, very compelling evidence, which you may, you're not going to achieve much other than applause from your echo chamber if you believe this, and you're going to cut yourself off from knowledge. And ultimately, I also believe you're going to do a disservice to the causes you want to support, because if you advance weak, shallow, unpersuasive arguments in service of a cause, or if you write an essay or do an assignment and don't produce rigorous evidence, an argument that considers the full gamut of opinions about this subject, you don't make a strong case, you don't truly understand it. So I think it's very important and interesting to try to build steel rather than straw men. Simply to say, okay, here's my view. So what's the strongest possible version of a different view? It doesn't even have to be an opposite view, just a different view. This is my perspective. I'm in Britain. This is my perspective on global trade. What might be the Chinese perspective on these events? Assuming I have any knowledge of China, which I may not. What might be the perspective of someone who is not from my class and background? What might be the perspective from someone who, for example, truly believes that in order to achieve a better society, far from needing to punish criminals, we need to forgive them, or conversely, far from needing to forgive criminals, we need to punish them harshly. I can't talk to other people. I can't inhabit these ideas critically and self-critically unless I can soberly contemplate the prospect that I'm wrong or misinformed. And so I'd like you to do a tricky thing for me. You don't have to share this one. You can if you want. But this is an exercise I often invite people to do in pairs and say, well, first of all, come up with a view you disagree with. I often encourage people to make it a silly view, by the way, as in unimportant. So rather than going straight to incredibly emotive topics, which can be very problematic, very challenging, perhaps very inconsiderate to debate, I might say, well, for example, here's a view I disagree with. Michael Bay's Transformers movies are the greatest masterpieces of cinema ever committed to the digital equivalent of celluloid. The man is a genius, and McGee just continued the great work with his sequels. I don't think that's true, but it's quite an interesting experience to try and make a strong case for it. Or I might say, well, actually, there's an argument that a McDonald's hamburger is the finest bit of food ever created. Because if you're a Democrat, it's popular, it's delicious, you can eat loads of them, it's affordable, it's non-snobby, it's nutritious, etc. Earth is flat. Star Trek is better than Star Wars. Is that a controversial view? I know we were talking Deep Space Nine, and I thought there's a good case to be made. Excellent. So lots of ideas here. Thank you so much for sharing these in the comfort of your own mind, whatever you like. And the point of this for me is very simple. Again, making the case, try it out loud if you like, in the comfort of your own Zoom room. Try it out loud. Trying to actually persuade someone else that this view you disagree with is true or brilliant or has merit can be a very interesting emotional experience. Very different than thinking about it in the abstract. Marvel is better than DC. Surely. Surely Marvel is better than DC. Superman, Red Sun, possibly. Oasis tickets are worth the price. Now, economists saying, well, trickle-down economics works. I'm loving these. I'm loving these. I see them and I instantly try to kind of come up with an argument in favor of them. Now, this is not to trivialize arguments in a moral or ethical domain. There are some points one has to have a position. There are some points that are incredibly important. I would not want to trivialize them, and I think it's very important that one doesn't. But I think it's possible to be playful about these things and rigorous, and encourage people, encourage students, almost through the idea of kind of role-playing experiment, that there can be a good discomfort. And if, for example, let's say that I'm an ethical vegetarian, and I very, very strongly believe that we should really be trying to get rid of meat consumption. But if I want to be persuasive about that and rigorous, I need to look into the countervailing arguments. I can't just say that people who disagree with me are fools and bad. I can't just say that all the evidence supports me, full stop. That's silly and unpersuasive. So critical self-reflection, these are great. Yeah. Lots, yeah, these are fantastic views. Thank you so much for sharing these. And I love the kind of the flash of the challenge in my mind. And the key point for me is that if we get people playing like this, if we get people comfortable with discomfort, with the pause, with the reconsideration, if we just move away from the idea that there's a simple, strong, accurate answer and others can be dismissed, then we open up critical thinking as a team sport. And also we open up to idealize the battle of ideas in that meaningful sense that Mill felt was so important. Now, the world has changed a lot since then. We have social media, we have AI, we have fakes, we have echo chambers. But for me, I think that makes it all the more important as a foundational practice to be able to contemplate the limits of your own knowledge, to not simply leap to the partisan, to the self-righteous or the defensive, to not simply leap to condemn, not least because in the end, it makes the condemnation you eventually arrive at, I think, all the stronger and more persuasive. It's a terrible thing to support a cause you truly believe in with a weak or flawed argument, because if you give a hostage to your opponents, if you fail to really think it through, then you weaken the very thing that you most wish to defend. Thank you so much for defending the coffee. If coffee was dangerous to our health, I wouldn't be talking to you now. I would be on my deathbed. Thank you so much. And so here's the final idea. And again, it's playful. And I put an emphasis on play and exercises, not because this is the be all and the end all, but partly because I feel that building habits and practices is partly about engagement and self-reflection, and partly about helping people to bake self-reflection as a kind of desired positive aspiration into the texture of work and study, which can feel so relentless, which can feel so pressured, which can feel so driven by data and deadlines. I love the comment that was shared earlier about a library and books, the kind of beautiful distraction of a library. I'm in the privileged position of being an author rather than a full-time academic. But again, in terms of my silly cognitive hacks, if I'm really wrestling with an important piece of work, I will sometimes just go off and read a book about something totally different. Just try to sink myself into something fascinating or fun. A bit like playing the piano, just because it will get me energized, it will challenge me and stretch me, it will free me to think twice, to hold my own ideas a little more loosely. And so here's my final exercise and structural tip: to play with frames of reference. So, fingers on buzzers, as they might say. Questions matter more than answers. To design a good menu is far more significant in terms of its import than what you choose off that menu. To ask the right question is incredibly important when an AI will answer it in 0.1 seconds incredibly convincingly. If we want to keep humans in the loop, it's not good enough for the place to be at the end when we just select which of an AI's answers we go through. We have to be in the loop at the start, framing the issue in the right way. And this begins with the fundamental realization that anything and everything can be seen in multiple ways. That what we take of as the normal, default, standard way of looking at X or Y is normal to us because of contingent historical reasons, but it is not normal in an absolute or definitive sense. So, what's this a map of? I said fingers on buzzers. I sort of meant fingers on chats. What's this a map of here? Don't think too hard. What are we looking at? It's not distorted. Oh, excellent. Yes, there we are. So we've got a lovely mixture. Thank you so much. We've got a lovely mixture here. It looks a little bit like the Gulf of Aden, Suez Canal, and of course it's got Arabic lettering, but it is indeed the Mediterranean turned through 90 degrees. So in the middle, we have the Balearic Islands. At the top, we have the Straits of Gibraltar. We have Spain, we have Italy, we have the Bay of Biscay, and so on. So it's a familiar map. It's a silly trick, of course. We've turned it through 90 degrees and it's got Arabic lettering. But then the Earth, although it does, of course, have magnetic poles and so on, the Earth doesn't come with a label and borders and a language attached to it. The Earth is a great big ball of rock with some water on it. And defamiliarizing things like this, just turning a map through 90 degrees can be a very powerful way of helping us consider questions and issues and ideas that we're not necessarily aware of because of the default framing. It's a very simple example here. Flipping the Mediterranean on its side and defamiliarizing the lettering, and by the way, getting rid of the national boundaries, emphasizes the very obvious fact that the Mediterranean is just as much about North Africa as it is about the European continent. They're very close to each other. Their histories are entwined. Just off here is the great city of Carthage, the great city of Alexandria, the great historical capitals of civilization in kind of Hellenic times. The fact that we have, I think now of Africa on one side and Europe on the other and have huge crisis of immigration is for many reasons to do with history and colonization and so on. But it's not a fact about the countries. It's not an inevitable fact. It's something that it's very powerful to defamiliarize. Here's another map. This is fairly obvious what's been done to this map. It's literally just another way of seeing the world, with the bit that we normally put at the top at the bottom, the bit we normally put at the bottom at the top. When I look at this map as someone born in Britain who's used to, for colonial reasons, seeing Britain and the meridian at the center of the map, it does make me think, my goodness me, there's a lot of sea, there's a lot of Indonesia, there's an awful lot of the world that is very little known to me, and far outside the experiences of my history, that is far bigger and probably more consequential in the long term than the little bit I happen to be clinging to. And this one here again, this is an equal areas projection. It does a very simple thing. Instead of the Mercator projection, which is navigational projection, making it easy to navigate the seas by falsely equalizing latitude and longitude, this one here accurately represents in 2 dimensions the relative areas of the countries of the world, the continents of the world. So we see here that the African continent is far larger in relation to Europe and the Northern Hemisphere, Greenland and so on, than it looks like it is in the famous Mercator projection. The African continent is absolutely vast, and it is shrunk by certain projections. And again, here we have a polar projection of the world. An interesting one in an age of global warming. Africa is larger, exactly correct. It is. The fact that it doesn't look larger in some projections is a distortion, is an inaccuracy for navigational and historical reasons. And so when we look at this one, we say, my goodness me, if there's no ice there, then certain countries really have got some interesting times to come. I'm being light-hearted, but the basic point is a really simple one. It's not that one of these projections, one of these views is right and you should always use it and other ones are bad and so on. It's simply that when I go into a classroom and show these to children or students and talk about this, it can just help them realize that there's more than one way of seeing the world. There are many different worldviews, literally views of the world, and they're good for different purposes, for different reasons. We might use one for one reason, one for another reason. We might want to have the boundaries of today's countries for some purposes, and no boundaries for another purpose. We might want to emphasize ocean, land, different hemispheres. We might want to draw on cables, population. We might want to distort the map to reflect population, and so on, and so on, and so on. The point's a very simple one. The moment we shift away from just assuming that one way of looking at things is the default, is the normal, is just the way it is, and instead start asking, well, which way of looking is more fit for our purposes, then we enter into a much richer discussion. How can we manage perceptions in certain directions? Well, among other things, we can talk, we can experiment, we can iterate, but of course we can also keep our purposes in mind. If you begin with saying, well, what are we trying to work out and why? What are we trying to assess? What are we interested in here? Then we can say, well, okay, given that, which particular framing, which data, which frame of reference is more or less fit for our purpose? If we're talking about history, well, whose history? Who are we going to read? If we're talking about geography, well, which part of the world are we looking at, and what assumptions do our maps, do our worldviews have baked into them? Now, reframing when it comes to maps is highly visual, but there are other simpler ways of reframing that I believe can be very powerful in an everyday study context. So for the last exercise, I want to invite you to do one simple exercise. Surely we can all agree that fairness is a common value. It's good, right? Companies have it. We want to be fair. We want AI to be fair. Being fair is good, being unfair is bad. However, what are we talking about when we talk about fairness? Are we all talking about the same thing? How many different kinds of fairness are there? So my question for you is simple. How many different ways of thinking about fairness can you come up with? How many different framings? How many different views? Go crazy. Share thoughts if you want to. Don't share thoughts if you don't want to, whatever you like. But simply undertaking this exercise is once again, I think, an interesting exercise in reminding ourselves that the questions we ask determine the answers it's possible for us to get. There can be as many definitions as people define the concept. Absolutely. We may still want the definition, however. Equity. Equity, but not equality. Fantastic. Yeah, how far? Yeah, wonderful, wonderful comments. Fairness. Does it even exist? Is fairness justice? Yes, equity, equality. Fantastic. Thank you so much for this. Yes. Yeah. Is fair giving everyone the same chance? Is fair giving everyone a chance in proportion to their abilities and potentials? Is fair ensuring that everyone has the same opportunities? Is fair enforcing the same outcomes? Is fair looking in a book written many thousands of years ago and saying we do what's in the book? Or is it rolling dice? Is fair tradition? Is fair justice? Or is fair blind fate? Is fairness surveying 1 million people and saying, what do you mean by fairness? And then picking an aggregate? Or is it what ChatGPT says? Does it benefit the greatest number of people or the number of great people? A level playing field. Is it even real? Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing these comments. As I hope you realize, I'm neither qualified nor capable of saying this one is right and this one is wrong. But what I can say is that a lot of people never ask this question. They talk about efficiency. They talk about fairness. They talk about values. They talk about human values. And they never even attempt to say, well, what do I mean by this word? I don't mean we should just become obsessed with semantics. That can be a dry, dead end. In some ways, it's the other way around. I think we should be obsessed with the diversity of thought that's out there. And the idea, to go back to this notion of a toolkit, that the words we use, the questions we ask, the lines of investigation we pursue, they're tools that can be defined as to how far they do or don't illuminate the questions we want to answer, the people we want to educate, the people we want to empower. Just going with the default setting, being unable to question that, is to some degree to let just someone else speak through you, to let a particular norm or set of assumptions dominate your thinking and control the answers it's possible for you to have. Now, none of us can just have something entirely our own and entirely original. We're all constrained by history and circumstances, but we can enter into an informed negotiation with that history and those circumstances together. And that, for me, is the great prize of critical thinking. It's not, I think, about reasoning and bludgeoning people with reasoning and logic. Reasoning and logic are wonderful. They're marvelous. They're powerful. They allow us to extrapolate from what we know to what that implies, to test our ideas and so on. But on the level of emotional self-regulation and reflection, I think we need to recognize that the assumptions we begin with, the habits we begin with, these things, they come before the reasoning. That if we can't pause, contemplate the limitations of our own views, soberly entertain the possibility that others may think different from us that might be valuable, and then try to ask together what the best and most valuable framing for a particular problem is. These are all, if you like, intellectual virtues and habits and practices. Yes, the word man is in the quote just because it's by Jonathan Swift. It's just what he said 200 odd years ago in Ireland. When, to be fair, the word did mean human, really. but those were deeply sexist times. So that's the end of my brief talk and provocations. I hope I've helped you to think a little and suggested that critical thinking for me is very practical discipline. There's all sorts of wonderful things we can study, and they're in my book, but it's putting it into practice that I think is the great prize, and particularly helping people to build the habits that underlie self-reflection, greater control over your own studies and ideas and progression. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Tom. And there's been so much activity in the chat and the Q&A as well. So I'm happy to dive into some of the group's queries. If you haven't had a chance to drop a question in the Q&A, we do welcome them. I have 4 at the moment. So I'll start with the first one that came in. So someone asks, how do I properly go about truth tables and identity fallacies, arguments, and syllogisms? Pretty specific.
I mean, this is a question about logic, about philosophical logic. And I would say, oh, that's very boring. You go to a technical logic textbook. They are, I mean, Wittgenstein, I think, originated the idea of truth tables. And it depends if you mean go about them as in teach them rigorously or teach them interestingly. So I mean, I think Wittgenstein and computer science and kind of Russell's logic kind of underlie a lot of this. But I guess very broadly, there's some really good textbooks on logic. There are some really kind of clear and frankly online formal explanations of these things. I think if one's teaching things like this, which can be quite dry, having concrete examples can be very powerful. I think interactive study can be very powerful. And actually, online resources can be very good if they're of high quality. I would say subjects like this are often, they're quite advanced. They're more covered in perhaps philosophical logic than they're covered in critical thinking. So my own book, and course, deals in fallacies. It deals in kind of formal and informal fallacies. It doesn't deal in enormous detail in truth tables and the underlying deductive forms of logic. From a personal point of view as well, I think for those who are studying them, computer science is a great series of analogies because they apply so directly to computer science and information theory. So I think it's quite fun to look at, kind of Boolean operators and that sort of thing. But that's sort of, but I guess, yeah, I guess with those topics, a really good textbook on logic and computer science, which really lays it out and then really working through nice concrete examples, real world examples, and seeing how it's used in the real world and applies to modern computer science is quite a fun way to go, perhaps.
Excellent, thank you. Pablo has an interesting question that involves AI. When we talk about developing critical thinking within the generative AI era, should we prepare educators in critical thinking before using AI or use AI to develop critical thinking?
Yes, so I very much favor a hybrid approach, which might, for example, be about getting a kind of a group of people to reflect upon a question, decide what they're interested in investigating, prompt an AI system, openly share the prompts they've used with their class, with their professor, and so on, and then critique the answer, look at its limitations, reprompt the system, try and find out the limits of its views and understandings, use a different system perhaps, really kind of play around with it, and then also, sort of discuss those results, try and triangulate them, go off and do their own research and sort of weave it in. And so I guess partly what I'm talking about to idealize is the idea of transparency, that if you ask people to use AI to share their prompts and to talk in a rigorous way about which systems they're using and why and how they're prompting them, but also that you try to encourage people to keep themselves in the loop by doing some pre-thinking beforehand, doing some discussion afterwards, and trying to be critically discerning users who don't just ask a question, but who interrogate an AI, push it, ask open models, and importantly, I think, then are also able to articulate their own views about what the AI has said, and present their own synopses that haven't been written. So I think the final answer should not be written by an AI. I think it should be seen as a research assistant, as a sounding board. Here's another tip as well. AIs are very good at adopting personas. So you could say, okay, you are a critical interlocutor. I'm going to give you the outline of my argument, and I want you to try and spot weaknesses in it or come up with counter arguments. So I was talking about the steel man exercise. You can get an AI to steel man you. You can get an AI to try to find weaknesses in your own thinking and make it more robust. And of course, we can try and identify the limits of an AI because, as has been noted in the comments, all AIs are trained upon data sets that encode various biases towards, for example, the Anglosphere, towards the historical assumptions baked into language about gender and stereotypes and so on. By definition, they don't know about certain things, so that's excluded from their data analyses. And there's subtle biases in there to do with the kind of language that you use when, quote unquote, talking to them. And so all that is to be, I think, noted and triangulated. But actually, I think the best advice for AIs is partly to play with them, to play and iterate, and remember that you are dealing with statistical engines that are producing plausible extrapolations from data. You're not talking to a person, you're not talking to a mind, you're talking to a kind of a hyper-competent statistical engine. And so tell it to play parts, boss it around, use it as a research assistant, but don't let it do the actual thinking for you.
Next question is on uncritical thinking, a bit earlier on. Would uncritical thinking be the cognitive basis of the quote-unquote irrational choice as described in behavioral economics, possibly addressed through some narrative-based, personally adapted and contextual learning experiences?
Yeah, so I think in the field of behavioral economics, I'm lucky enough to have discussed this a bit with Danny Kahneman before he died recently, when he and I worked together on a critical thinking project, and one of the ways that he came to talk about cognitive bias is that you can think of a bias as a misfiring heuristic. So heuristics are great. They're mental shortcuts, they're rules of thumb that help us make safe, efficient decisions that allow us to get through our daily lives. We can't pause and think critically about everything because we'd never get anything done and we'd probably get run over. But a cognitive bias occurs when a heuristic leads us into error. And when it comes to, so I don't tend to like the word irrational, funnily enough. I find it unhelpful because it presupposes that there's a narrow standard of rationality that is good, and then anything outside that is bad. Whereas often a heuristic is, if you like, an intuition that is inapplicable to a circumstance. I mean, I guess it's irrational in the sense that it leads to a non-optimal view. So here's a very simple example. The halo effect describes the fact that when someone or something possesses good qualities like attractiveness in our eyes or whatever, we tend to assume it has other good qualities. This is partly why you might see attractive people in adverts. The fact that a car is being driven by a beautiful person through a beautiful town demonstrably doesn't make that car better at being a car. It doesn't really have any implications for the quality of its engineering, but I am, like anybody else, probably more likely to buy a car or think it's good if I see an advert in which it's being driven through the Italian Riviera by beautiful people, rather than if it's sitting in a garage covered in old fish. So that's a misfiring heuristic. But when it comes to behavioral economics and irrationalism, I think the key is to realize that we ourselves can try and enter into an informed negotiation with these limitations, that by framing things in the right way, we can seek to use our heuristics in ways that are very positive. So Danny had one very simple example that people tend to be quite bad at guessing numbers out of the blue. Like if you ask people to put percentages on, what are you 99% confident, or, what's your level of confidence that X is going to happen, and people guess something and it tends to be really wrong. However, if you get people to rank things in a group and say, pick these 5 events and rank them in order of perhaps most to least likely or most to least important, they perform very well because our apprehensions are quite good at ranking comparisons. And again, another simple example of this is to do with planning. So if you say to people, oh, you've got this great plan, how's your project going to go? People who are very invested in a project will often be overly optimistic. And again, we see sunk costs and all kinds of problems where we're very slow to kind of face up to the fact that our lovely project is going badly. You know, when you're going to finish your book? Oh, I'll have it finished, you know, within 2 months. Will I? No, it's going to be 6 months, if that. But I'm over optimistic. But we can disarm this heuristic, or we can harness the heuristic in a different way by instead saying, okay, imagine it's 2 years from now. You still haven't delivered this book and everything's gone wrong. Now tell me the story of why it went wrong. List all the reasons it went wrong. Let's play a game. This is sometimes called a pre-mortem, and it's a very powerful way of getting people to actively imagine confounding scenarios and things that go wrong. And then when you say, okay, well, given all that, assume you want to mitigate it and finish your book, when you're going to do it, I might then say, okay, well, looking at all that, it's going to be 6 months or so because I'm going to have to overcome this and that and this and that. So what I'm saying, a bit laboriously perhaps, is that, yes, of course, we are irrational a lot of the time. But I personally shy away from the rational-irrational dichotomy because I think it's sort of more accurate and more useful to try and look at the way our minds tend to work, our apprehensions tend to work, and find ways to work with the grain of those, and to try and elevate our cognition and find things where our heuristics work in our favor, rather than being very quick to say, well, that's irrational, that's wrong, and therefore, kind of by definition, these people are silly, and it's evidence that we're all stupid. You know, collectively, we can actually overcome our limitations to an astonishing degree. That, of course, is what things like the scientific method are all about. Great question. So I don't even know if I got answered it, but that was a great question.
Speaking of methods, 2 questions have actually come in around assessing critical thinking. What tools or how can you assess students' critical thinking that are already developed by experts?
Yes, so I'm going to have to confess, I do not have a sort of list of off-the-shelf things for you. There are courses that people can complete with kind of, I mean, some of the most basic stuff that I value is kind of specific, almost checklists, very basic kind of evidence of self-reflection, of saying, well, there are these, you know, show that you've done X, Y, and Z, demonstrate critical reflection, demonstrate that and of course, the joy of a particular critical thinking kind of module or done in parallel to other modules is that in a way you can incentivize the kind of self-reflection and discussion. But I personally rely a lot on self-assessment, on people doing things like journaling, on people doing things like reflecting on their habits, upon people forming kind of study groups and coming up with kind of checklists and identifying their particular strengths and weaknesses and tools that work, and sharing practices and mentoring. I'm aware this doesn't fit in with all assessment paradigms. This is difficult. But I think what can then group work can be marked for its quality. Because I mean, you can have group work handed in where people have, you know, and people co-mentoring. So even in schools, some work I've done with people is saying, well, okay, imagine that you're, you know, coming up with things that you wish that your, you know, 15 or 16-year-old self had known. You're going to kind of write a list of these things, and then they're actually going to be used by people younger than you, or you're going to mentor someone, or as a group, you're going to share strategies and develop them together, and you're going to get credit. Your assignments, your credit is going to be for developing strategies, developing advice, having an implementation plan, doing some mentoring, journaling and recording progress in these areas, conducting some self-reflection about, okay, here's Tom's book or some course which has got sort of 20 different things. I want you to think about how in practice 2 or 3 of these could be useful in your work, and I want to see your reflections on how you're using them to make this essay better, this assignment better, this undertaking more rigorous. I'm not convinced by off-the-shelf stuff. That just might be my own ignorance. And of course, interactive courses do work quite well. That's partly why I like designing them for Sage and others, because you get to interact, you get to do quizzes, you get to, you know, it gets people doing. And I do think, as you hopefully seen in this session, that the doing one way or another and then reflecting upon the doing is the prize.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you everyone for your questions. We weren't able to get to all of them as we're about to approach time, but they were very thought-provoking.
Yes. Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you so much for the presentation. I saw someone saying in the chat that you would make a fantastic therapist, which I think is a I completely agree with that. And yes, thank you so much for this. This was really thought-provoking, and because we couldn't answer all the questions, we're going to take these away, and we might do a few blog posts on some of the topics. So we'll send that to you, and watch out for some more content from us. We'll share the links to the recording. As I said, we can share the slides as well. I saw some people asking for that. And we'll share links to Tom's work. There's, as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of books out there. He's done the course for Sage Campus and the module for Sage Skills. So there's going to be lots of additional content that you can find out. So I think this is all from us today. So thank you everyone for joining. We hope you found this useful and insightful as I have. And we'll see you next time.
Fantastic. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much for dialing in. Take care. Bye.
Bye.